think it's not important, not necessary, not needed to introduce Michael Walzer at all. It wouldn't be even the day before yesterday, but now it's even less needed. He is a very, very well-known figure. So I'll skip this introductory part, but I'd like to read a few of the lines that I think would be proper to read at this point, especially in the light of what happened yesterday when Professor Walzer was honored with Doctor Causa Doctoris, what's that? No honoris causa by the Belgrade University, and we may consider him as being one of us now. He's our colleague as the member of Belgrade University. So he is subject to the same criteria that we all are subject to, and we have sometimes to give a bit of legitimization. So I'll read a few lines in accordance of that need to legitimize. Professor Walzer long argued that political theory must be grounded in the traditions and culture of particular societies, and opposed what he sees to be the excessive abstraction of political philosophy. His most important intellectual contribution include Just and Unjust Wars, a revitalization of just war theory that insists on the importance of ethics in wartime while issuing pacifism. The theory of complex equality, which holds that the metric of just equality is not some single material or moral good, but rather that egalitarian justice demands that each good be distributed according to its social meaning, and that no good, like money or political power, be allowed to dominate or distort the distribution of goods in other spheres. And an argument that justice is primarily a moral standard within particular nations and societies, not one that can be developed in a universalized abstraction. So Professor Michael Walzer will have the first lecture. This session has been devoted to Professor Walzer, but in a way the whole conference is devoted to Professor Walzer. The title of his lecture is The Aftermath of War, Reflections on Jus Post Bellum, something that is, there is nothing more important for us at this time. It's extremely timely topic, especially for us here in these parts of the world. Please.
Well, I am delighted to speak to you as an honorary member of the faculty of the University of Belgrade, and I have to apologize for beginning this conference with what might plausibly have come at its end, since I am going to be talking about what comes after war, and most of the other speakers will be addressing questions that are prior to mine. As a distinct category, Jus Post Bellum is not part of classic just war theory. But there is an important sense in which the outcome of a war is supposed to be anticipated in its beginning. The standard understanding of aggression holds that it is a violation of the status quo ante. The world was at peace in such and such an arrangement of states and borders, which was supposed to be just insofar as it was established, conventional, widely accepted, and also insofar as its stability made for regional or global peace. The aggressor violently disrupts this arrangement, moving an army across the existing border, and then a just war restores the arrangement and the border. The idea of reparations gains its force from this understanding. The breaking of the old order has to be repaired. Though the violence of the aggression and the human damage that it produced cannot be undone, We can compensate the surviving victims and rebuild the ruined cities. We insist that the aggressor must make things as much as it can just like they were before. And that, on this view, which I take to be the classic view, is the definition of a just outcome. And it's worth noting that the early modern idea of a political revolution derives from this conception of a just war. The tyrant started the revolutionary process by breaking the established constitutional order, attacking his subjects, violating their rights. Tyranny was understood as a kind of aggression. And then the people, organized perhaps by their lesser magistrates, justly defended themselves and restored the Constitution. The movement was circular, ending where it began. A revolution that didn't end in a restoration would not have revolved completely. So, just war and revolution understood in its terms are deeply conservative ideas, though what they aim to conserve is the peacefulness of the status quo ante, not its particular political arrangements, which may indeed need to be changed, but only through normal politics, not through war. There are always state leaders who believe that their country's borders aren't where they should be, or that the division of colonial possessions and spheres of influence, or the access to natural resources is fundamentally unjust. That may or may not be so. The status quo is usually unjust, though not in the way state leaders believe it is. In any case, just war theory holds that war is not a permissible remedy. When Francisco de Vitoria said that the only justification for war is an injury received, he meant a recent injury that violated the existing conventions and arrangements, not an injury received 100 years before that had been incorporated into the existing conventions and arrangements. Territorial irredentism was no more an excuse for war than imperial ambition. Violent disruptions of the status quo were, almost by definition, unjust. The 1991 Gulf War provides a nice example of the classical understanding of post-bellum justice. Restoration for both sides, reparations for one side. The first Bush administration thought that its war was justly concluded when Kuwait was liberated from the Iraqi occupation and Saddam Hussein, his aggression defeated, was still in power back in Baghdad and able to pay reparations. Justice did not extend to regime change. It did extend to the imposition of restraints on the Iraqi regime, but the purpose of those, or at least their initial purpose, was to make the old border safe. This was a contested view at the time, especially because President Bush had called for rebellions against the Baghdad regime, and when these occurred and were savagely repressed, he did nothing to help the rebels. Still, stopping the war after the liberation of Kuwait was in accord with the classic view of a just ending and a just peace. And there is something to be said for this view. Think of how many lives would have been saved if the Korean War had ended as soon as American and South Korean forces had repelled the North Korean invasion and restored the old boundary, however unsatisfactory that boundary was. Or imagine what the Middle East might look like today had Israel, after winning the Six-Day War in 1967, immediately restored the Gaza Strip to Egypt and the West Bank to Jordan. In both these cases, the ambition was for a better peace than the status quo ante, but it produced outcomes that were arguably worse. So one might say, as Avishai Margalit has recently suggested, that the actual goal of just war theory is not a just peace, but just a peace. That peace itself, as it existed before the war began and as it might exist after the war ends, is the actual goal without regard to its substantive justice. Given the awfulness of war, peace is what just warriors should seek. But is this, in fact, just any peace? Suppose that the aggressor state wins the war and establishes a peace that is not like the status quo ante, but that is still peace in the literal sense, the absence of war. Do we have to accept this kind of peace? Or do we have to oppose it only politically? Or is it morally permissible? Or is it morally necessary to renew the just war at the first opportunity? How long does it take before the new peace constitutes a status quo that it would be unjust to disrupt? We need some understanding of how peace and justice connect in order to answer these questions. I would suggest that the connection must be strong but minimalist, so as to sustain the recognition that peace itself is a value at which we can justly aim and sometimes live with, even if it is unjust. But in this lecture this morning, I'm going to assume the victory of the just warriors and ask what their responsibilities are after victory. And sometimes, I want to argue, sometimes, but not all the time, they must aim at an outcome that is different from the status quo ante and that is more than just a peace. Restoration and reparation may be right for the victims of aggression, but may not be the right way to deal with the aggressor regime, which they leave intact and in power. What if the act of aggression is inherent in the nature of the regime, as in the case of Nazi Germany? No one on the Allied side imagined that the war could end justly with Hitler still in power, even if his government then paid reparations to all its victims. Begin with what we can think of as provision. They have to provide law and order, food and shelter, schools and jobs. Of course, they will do this insofar as they can through local agents, members of the old civil service, the old army, the old police force, who were not involved in the crimes of the genocidal regime, and also internal opponents of the regime and returning exiles. But ultimate responsibility belongs to the occupying forces. The American army in Iraq in 2003 was radically unready to take on this responsibility after the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime, and we can take this unreadiness as a useful example. It was a clear violation of the norms of jus post bellum. This is true whatever the justice of the invasion and however the war was fought. Post-bellum justice is independent of ad bellum and in bello justice in the same way as these latter two are independent of each other. An unjust war can lead to a just outcome, and a just war can lead to an unjust outcome. Once immediate necessities are provided, the critical obligation of the invading and occupying forces is political reconstruction. The obligation is the same whether a single state has supplied the forces or a coalition of states or an international agency. And it's a hard obligation because what it requires is the creation of a regime that can dispense with its creators, that can literally tell them to leave. The goal of reconstruction is a sovereign state, legitimate in the eyes of its own citizens, an equal member of the International Society of States, and as soon as that goal is reached, the occupying forces will probably be asked to leave, and they should leave. It will be a test of the justice of the occupation that they have not created a puppet government and that they make no claim to permanent military bases or to economic privileges and contracts unavailable to other states. They can aim at a friendly government. It's hard to imagine them doing anything else, but this must be a friendly government fully capable of acting in its own interests. Should they aim at a democratically elected government? I want to say yes to this question, not because democracy is the best regime, though I think it is, but because it has historically been the regime least likely to turn on its own people. I can imagine ways less formal than elections to produce a responsible government. In a tribal society, for example, customary forms of consultation may still be robust and effective. But democracy is generally to be preferred for the sake of its inclusiveness. The modern demos includes everyone, men and women, rich and poor, majorities and minorities, and so it offers greater protection than a regime of oligarchs or patriarchal chiefs or clerics of the dominant religion. Protecting women, or better, empowering women so that they can protect themselves, is especially important since they are often the first civilian victims of war and the last beneficiaries of reconstruction. Giving them the vote is only a first step, but it is an important step toward guaranteeing their security. Jus post bellum is most importantly about social justice in its minimal sense, the creation of a safe and decent society. But it's also about justice in the other sense, its other sense, about doing justice to the perpetrators of tyranny, aggression, mass murder, and ethnic cleansing. I have already alluded to the Nuremberg precedent for the establishment of international tribunals, followed with mixed results in cases like the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. Do justice even if the heavens fall is not a good idea in the aftermath of war. Jus post bellum's first aim, as I've been arguing, is to stop the heavens from falling. Sometimes a clear judicial repudiation of mass murder and the punishment of the murderers is the best way to forge a secure peace. Sometimes security might require amnesties and public forgetfulness. Sometimes the simple exposure and acknowledgement of crimes may point the way to reconciliation. In these life and death cases, just a peace takes precedence over a just peace, though we should certainly try to bring the two together. Finally, there are certain lingering obligations that may affect what I've called the timing and character of getting out. The invading and occupying forces must make sure that the new regime is in fact non-murderous, committed to defend and capable of defending the most vulnerable of its citizens. And if any of them are not safe, they must be given the opportunity to leave with the occupying forces. They must be taken in by the occupying state. This obligation holds, again, whether the intervention and the occupation were just or unjust. The French, after the Algerian War, were bound to take in the Harkis, the Arab soldiers who fought in the French army, whom, in fact, they left behind and who were massacred after the departure of the French army. And the Americans, after Vietnam, were bound to take in the boat people. Indeed, the people who took to the boats should have been helped to leave before they had to do that. John Rawls's argument about privileging the worst off in domestic society has an analogy here. We must attend to those most at risk when ending the occupation of a foreign country. War is a time of killing and being killed. The crucial requirement of jus post bellum is the preservation of life. That's the minimalist reason that I have given for trying to set up a democratic regime, and it is the reason for everything else that invading and occupying armies must do, for the provision of necessities, for special attention to vulnerable men and women, for movement toward gender equality, for something as close as possible to justice for war criminals and murderers. There is work here that foreign forces can do, but ultimately the work has to be taken over and sustained by the local population. The post in jus post bellum is not of infinite duration. Moral and political requirements must be met over whatever time it takes, but the shorter, the better. Thank you.